We are sitting in Malir with the Khalifa, who is performing a Gwati ceremony. Gwat is a Baloch word for spirits of the wind. These days, Gwats have become more volatile as development, infrastructure, and extraction destroy the balance between land, sea, and air. Possessions manifest these ecological disturbances in the body as fevers and burnings. They force us to reckon with both sacred, hidden worlds and the invisible presence of environmental toxicity and imbalance.
You just listened to an excerpt of the audio artwork Safarnama by Saraab, an ongoing collaboration between Omer, Wasim and Shahana Rajani, who live and work in Karachi. I am Niyati, curator and program manager at Khoj.
I'm Alina, Tiphagne, media and communications manager at Khoj. Khoj is a contemporary arts organization and triangle network partner based in New Delhi, India. Through our programs, we support and incubate emerging, experimental, and transdisciplinary creative practices and pedagogies. Since our inception in 1997, we have been committed towards building global networks and solidarity, especially in the subcontinent.
When the pandemic hit us last year, Khoj had begun a project looking at the toxicity of air. We collaborated with TBA 21 to put out an open call that invited proposals that engaged with the idea of air's composition, movement, landscapes, and scales of impact. These projects were to be hosted on TBA 21's stage platform, and Saraab was one of the selected artists we began working with.
Their work, Safarnama, which you just heard, traces the journey of a jinn, a mythical entity in Islamic theology, from desert to sea in Pakistan, along the route of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a massive infrastructural project that threatens displacement and environmental degradation. Today, we catch up with them to talk about the role of collaboration and intimacy in their practice, to reflect on their process of making Safarnama, and to talk about their ongoing project, the Tenderness Kit. We begin by asking the artists how Saraab came about.
Thank you for having us here. Me and Omer both actually shifted back to Karachi from grad school in 2013. And we've been friends since then. We've been working as artists since then. And I think over the years, we were both really struggling with the way that the art world is structured. I think post 2013 was also a time when we started noticing that culture, art making was being really instrumentalized for both global and national wartime agendas. And we were also noticing over the years that the institution of the art gallery was becoming increasingly depoliticized. There was sort of a real effort on the part of those in power to specifically divorce art making from all and any kinds of politics. And I think this really we saw this really kind of peak in the form of the Karachi Biennale, right, which is an institution that is set out to provide support, to give a platform to all artists in Pakistan, in Karachi. But the way that KB worked sort of really reminded us as to the problems and the issues that exist in the art world, whether it's, opportunism, nepotism, state censorship, fetishization of, colonial quote unquote heritage, the kind of complete disregard for or providing support for younger artists. I think those were all kind of experiences that we felt really strongly over the past couple of years, and this was building in both of our encounters working with most institutions in the city. And so I think over the years, me and Omer, with a bunch of friends, have schemed many, many times. We've made many khayali pulaus of what we can do and what we should do. And I guess Saraab is the manifestation of those years of brainstorming, khayali palaos. Omer, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think that we wanted to sort of come up with an entity that could sort of shape shift and become multiple. So I mean, our sort of contributions are artistic, but also to a certain degree curatorial. So I think that we wanted to sort of build what we had hoped to inhabit ourselves, you know. So I think that to provide community, to provide support, to sort of become multiple in a way, to sort of create a generative space where we're able to offer multiple entry points into whatever it is that we are thinking about or studying. Um, so yeah, and then to also kind of think about how art making can be politicized, is always political, and mobilized to sort of generate multiple readings of the present. Um, I mean, yeah, I think it is also very, very important for us um, to have a practice that can sort of unfold over time slowly. Um, yeah, and I think that we're very invested in working slowly and carefully.
What, just to add to what Omer is saying, I think the sense of durational work was really, really important for us because we were really feeling that so much of making, exhibiting had around us had become so sensational. It was about producing spectacles, right? Even the Biennale format is this one big fancy, you know, millions of rupee funded event that just happens once a year and then nothing. And so we were really wanting to investigate and invest in slower but also quieter forms of working where we're really kind of playing between the politics of visibility but also invisibility, right? That these are strategic moments in which you make yourself visible, but also strategic moments when you're doing political work that you need to remain invisible, you need to be under the radar, that certain kinds of work cannot be displayed and consumed in mainstream ways. And so really kind of, I think, playing with this tension, this contradiction, navigating it, inhabiting it. I think also what Omer was saying around wanting to create and build what we initially wanted to inhabit, right? The lack that we found in the world around us, to try to work towards that ideal. And I think in that sense, when we began talking about and thinking about Saraab, this kind of idea around tender infrastructures, tender ecologies, was really kind of exciting and important to us because so much of the art world around us felt very rigid, very hard. It felt very extractive, felt very hierarchical. And so I think we were and we are really interested in inhabiting sort of leakages, spaces that exist between to provide, to create kind of moments of softness, moments of ease within kind of a world of unease. Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of come back to what you said about this idea of kind of collaboration and doing things on a quieter, slower scale, because to me, Safarnama is really interesting because even when it's grappling with like this large scale sort of infrastructural intervention and it's drawing attention, it's doing it on the register of bodies and I think there's a sense of intimacy that imbues the entire piece. And that kind of intimacy carries forward also with your newer works. So yeah, I just wanted to like basically ask about what do you see in terms of like the potential of the intimate and cracking open even sort of larger inquiries.
We both come from collaborative backgrounds, you know, and I think that I think in the ways that the art world is structured in Pakistan because of lack of infrastructure and support. I think that we've all had to take on full-time jobs, and I think that making art requires a lot of time, a lot of effort. And I think that, and I'm saying this knowing that, that we all know this already. But I think that when Sarah and I sort of were working together, I think that we were also thinking about how do we sort of multiply the time that we do have, right? So I think that collaboration, even on a very basic level, allows us to it allows us to sort of inhabit more time, just on a very basic level. But again, I mean, I think that over the years also, I think that we have come into collaborations and we are informed by collaborations, and all the work that we do is an accumulation of sorts, right? It's an accumulation of multiple viewpoints of inhabiting space, like somewhat of a similar space with different positions. So I think that when you are navigating or living in a city like Karachi, I think that the violence of the built space or of the city is encountered on a very intimate level, and I think that possibly sort of seeps through our work because I think that we also make work through an act of not maybe not an act of through I don't know. Shahana, please help. I think I'm sort of.
No, I think what you said was so beautiful, right? This idea, I think, of collaboration, kind of challenging, rethinking, revising the ways in which we are taught to experience and think about time, to think about art making. So I also, like Omer, have one of the kind of main modes of art making for me is collaboration. And with a friend, Zara Malkani, we in 2015 formed this kind of long-term pedagogical project called Karachi La Jamia. And La Jamia means anti-university. So it came directly out of our experiences working and teaching in art schools, a critique of the art institution, both at a higher education level and also the gallery. And I feel like for both of us at that point, when we began working together, collaborating, it really sort of gave us a different viewpoint on and a different perspective on art making, to also think about how gendered our notions and understanding of artists are. Right? This idea of the male genius, this idea, right, that's perpetuated that this kind of genius work is the work of isolation. It's the work of one person. It's the work of this focus on individuality. And I think as we began working together, all of those things just kept falling apart, right? That individuality is, if anything, works at odds against you, right? That it's in collectivity, it's in relationality with people around you that the best ideas emerge. And I think that's something that we really, really felt in the Tenderness kit also, and in the series of exchanges in the past year that led up to the kit, and I remember this friend of ours, Nashin, actually said that I had sent an email and she replied saying that, oh, damn, I was thinking about the exact same thing, right? That in some ways our thoughts are also not individual, but because we spend so much time with each other, constantly emerging from one another. So there's also this idea of soul authorship is something that we've really been trying to challenge, to rethink. And yeah, intimacy is at the heart of this kind of thinking of collaboration as relationality and as community almost as well. In terms of our methods, I think, and maybe Omer can add to this, but so it's interesting that even though Safarnama was released before Tenderness Kit is actually the project that we first started working on together. So in some ways we think of it as our first project, and it's a project that we did during the lockdown last year. And it was basically kind of, obviously, we were all experiencing lockdown as a moment of alienation. There was so much fear, anxiety, right? There was all of a sudden this kind of idea of touch, of intimacy was kind of completely being pathologized. And we were all sort of just confined to our homes. We stopped meeting our friends, our communities. And so we sort of decided to do this project that we call the Tenderness Kit, which we imagined to be a series of email exchanges with friends who make our community. And the idea very much was that in this moment, we felt we were all dissociating from our body, right? That there was so much germ phobia and kind of so much disdain for human contact that we were all really kind of disconnecting. And so the project specifically was with the idea to return to our bodies. And I think one of the first texts we read together for it was Audre Lorde's The Power of the Erotic, and thinking about the erotic as a way to reconnect with the body, as a way to reconnect with the spiritual, with the sacred, with various different kinds of things, not just sexuality in the reduced way that we understand it.
Whenever we think about research, I think that vision is always centered, and I think that one of the things that we are super invested in is to kind of stretch open vision and to also problematize it. So to kind of also figure out ways of knowing differently, and I think that a return to the body, as we had imagined, like Tenderness Kit to do, entails like inhabiting all senses, while also not entirely centering vision. And I think that mode of inquiry or that mode of investment continues in Safarnama. I think that we were also working with air, which is for Safarnama, we were thinking about air, and air is also an invisible medium. And I think that so much of sensory work is also invisible work.
For the Tenderness Kit, what we ended up doing in a way to jumpstart our relationship to our body, to think about the sensorial, to think about the multiplicity of senses, not just seeing, was that with the kind of people, with the people we had invited to participate, we every few weeks initiated an email thread centered around various different senses. And people just, these sort of email threads took on a life of their own that we, I think, had not even anticipated, in how much sharing and how much intimacy was created through these threads in a moment of deep, deep crisis, right?
And also, we never forced anyone to sort of reply to these emails either. So I think that there were a lot of ellipses in between. And I think that within those ellipses, I think that there was a lot that was unsaid. And I think that as we were working on this, and as weeks turned into months, I think that we were able to animate those ellipses also, those silences. And I think that to be in sync like that is also, there's a lot of power and beauty in that, and I think that we often negate those ellipses or silences when we work in traditional ways. And I think that also the present then was so charged that that time was also doing strange things, right? I think that time was also, we were inhabiting time differently. Time was also constantly being sort of pulled and stretched. How should I say this? An email thread evolved over months, right? And sometimes it was instantaneous. People would return to things after months. So time was very fluid in the ways that this project came into its own.
And I feel like, Omer, this was perhaps the first project that we fully embraced the futility of deadlines.
Yeah.
Right. But when we started, we thought this would be like a month or 2 month long kind of engagement. And then we would have this, people would share their works, we'd make a skit and we just put it out. But it actually took us over a year to share the skit online.
I think Shahana and I were talking about this only a few weeks ago, or maybe like even last week, that I think that in retrospect, we really enjoyed working on Safarnama because I think that it it made other modes of knowing more accessible to us, right? Because we were doing this out in the field with a compressed timeline. So I think that, so yeah, and I think that it made the experience of putting together a tenderness kit all the more complex for us and perhaps richer.
I guess we've so far only been thinking of these as two separate projects. It's really interesting that this conversation is actually making me realize how connected both things were, just in terms of thinking about the method, right, of the sensorial, how interlinked these two were, but also I'm now thinking that important part of the tenderness kit conversations were very much about our relationship to the natural and sacred worlds. And I think Safarnama also continues that, right, in its investigation of air, right? When we pitched the project, I think both me and Omer were thinking about how air, again, is something that we've all never thought about. We think is invisible, but somehow the pandemic had really centered the air, but as contagion, as disease, as pathology. And we really wanted to think about the other kinds of older connections that we have to air, where air has been considered a sacred medium to other worlds, other dimensions. And so in some ways, I'm only now thinking through that this kind of the inquiry of Safarnama is also quite connected to the exchanges and the conversations that we were having in the kit.
Yeah, I definitely see that kind of connection with, I guess it's also a sort of mobilizing of micro attentions, right? And that for me is, yeah. And I think I was also working on that timeline and also negotiating a much sort of, because like you said, like our experience of time this time last year was very, very different. I think I kind of slipped into this sort of dream state of not fully knowing what day it was or like what week it was. So on one hand, it was this rootedness in having a timeline to work with, right? And that was maybe the only timeline I had at that point, which felt like an anchor. But then on the other hand, there was this sort of like other state of just dreamy strangeness happening, where like my only kind of indicator for time sometimes was, looking at patches of sunlight and where they were and being able to read them. So for me, that was really interesting. I like that kind of psychic negotiation of how I'm thinking of time on the whole, and then how I have to at some point come back into having a more regimented idea of time, because of the stuff that was going on. Yeah.
So it's so interesting. I'm like hearing you say this, and I'm also realizing that for Safarnama, like working on the jinns also, again, it challenged so much our routine ideas around time. That in some ways, yes, of course, the project was so compressed and we had such like hard deadlines and we were undertaking a whole new project. And so much kind of field research, all of these things that were really exciting, but also there was a lot of pressure to produce, right? Which I guess is also an interesting kind of prerequisite that comes with funding also, right? Which I think in tenderness kit was something that we were refusing in some ways. But I'm just thinking, hearing you speak, that two things, that with the Safarnama project, doing this research around jinns, one of the first things that we sort of were thinking about was how human time and jinn time is just so different, right? Just because our lifespan is so much shorter, that jinns are known to have been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so that kind of like thinking about the jinn also forces you to be expansive in a way that we are not used to at all, thinking about the distant past, the distant future, in a moment where we were just so consumed by the immediacy of the present. So I think that was something really interesting that happened and that the project allowed us to do. It was in some ways like no other research that we've ever done before, right? Because doing research around jinns, we were going to meet people who are possessed by jinns. We were going to meet experts who perform exorcisms. We're doing all of this work, and jinns are something that both me and Omer strongly believe in, right? That they're these beings made from wind and fire, made by God, that exist in our world around us, but are not visible to us. So they're very different from ghosts. And the relationship of the jinn to the human can be one of friendship and intimacy, but in popular culture, it is an antagonistic relationship, right? So the word majnu, we found out, which means madness, comes from the word jinn, right? So people who were possessed by jinns were driven crazy as a result of this possession. So this was also a kind of really haunting work that we did, where we were coming into really close contact with jinns or people who were intermediaries for jinns. We would always come back from research. We would be afraid. I would be afraid to sleep at night. I was getting dreams about jinns. It really took over my life, those few months of research and the sense of both so much curiosity and wonder, but also the sense of deep fear around the unknown. I think really messed with my notion and understanding of time as well.
In the early hours of an October morning, we drove along the Makran Coastal Highway in Balochistan, past white sand beaches and limestone mountains on our way to Gwadar. I remembered being told as a child that jinns were drawn to thresholds. Jinns relished in these in-between spaces. They saw in the border an invitation for crossing. Gwadar comes from two Balochi words, Gwat meaning air and Dar meaning door. It was known in ancient times as the Gateway of Winds, a port on the Arabian Sea that connected Balochistan with Iran, Muscat, Zanzibar, and Aden. Was the jinn traveling in search of this gateway, this threshold? Gwat is a rare leftover remnant of centuries-old belief systems that hold air as sacred, that name breath and wind as the very substance of our spirit. Winds were once the means of knowing. Just as human utterance was inseparable from breath, the landscape, rivers, oceans, forests, and mountains all had the power of speech conveyed and carried by air and wind. The whistling wind blowing against limestone rocks, the waves breaking against the shore, the rustling of the leaves of date palm trees all had their own language, enabling both humans and spirits to bind their senses to the shifting sounds and gestures of the earth, to remain connected and informed by the life of the land.
So what you said about, Saraab existing in the spaces that are in between, and sort of connecting it to some of the conversations we've had about the transboundary sort of collaborations and the political repercussions of what transboundary in the South Asian context can mean specifically for, even a Khoj working with, Saraab.
I think increasingly South Asian borders have hardened around us. I think that to collaborate with people from India or Bangladesh seems very, very impossible. And I think that during this lockdown, I think that a whole new world of collaboration became available, because I think that we were operating not not in physical space, but sort of in a way virtual space. Um, so yeah, I think that it's great, but I'm also hoping that we are able to sort of inhabit sort of physical spaces too eventually, and think about, because I think that the things that we are thinking about, climate change or air, I think that these things are not necessarily informed by borders that are enforced on the spaces that we live in, right? I think that air sort of moves freely across India and Pakistan, and climate change is manifesting in real tangible ways. So I think that to be able to make sense of the present, we need to do it together. And I think that the lockdown and the pandemic sort of has opened space for us to kind of think about these bigger issues that sort of color all our lives together, you know. So yes, I mean, I think that there's I think it's wonderful that we are able to sort of work together and think together, but I'm also hoping that we are able to one day hopefully translate all of this into real space, you know.
Also, to give some context, Alina, to what you were mentioning as well. So, in the past few years, it has become near impossible for us as Pakistanis to get an Indian visa and to travel across the border. I imagine maybe it's the same on your side. It's become impossible for us to go to visit Bangladesh, right? And so it's this kind of the region around us is becoming really, really increasingly hard to access. And on the other side, the networks that are available to artists in Pakistan are, of course, right, the organizations and funding from Europe, from the US, from Canada, from, you know, all of these places. And in some ways, it's such a strange predicament that we're unable to work with and collaborate with people who live around us, who share this region with us. And it's much easier to work with people who are so much further away, but right, that these imperial networks of funding that are so strongly set in place. And when I think me and Omer started Saraab, I think one thing that we've also really cognizant of is that to work against this grain and to really try really, really hard to find ways to have South to South dialogue, to build regional networks, to strengthen them. I think a lot of work in building has happened, and we're continuing on the backs of people in the previous decades from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, and elsewhere who have done this kind of work of creating bridges, of creating networks. And I think one of the intentions we set out was to really work on continuing those bridges across borders, yeah. And I mean, we were really lucky that soon after we had just spoken about this, we saw Khoj's open call and applied for it, and yeah, things worked out really amazingly, and we're super grateful for that.
It goes without saying that all of us are entangled within these sort of geographies, right? I think that our sort of I mean, both Shahana and I sort of trace our sort of family histories back to India, and it's really, really difficult to make peace with the fact that we don't have access to um, access to it.
Yeah, I think there's also particular irony to, you know, some of this funding becoming the only way to unlock these collaborations.
True.
But I think in general, like this is something we all struggle with from our context, is basically this implicit assumption of a center, right? Of a center that holds kind of funding that, you know, a lot of work goes back to for exhibitions, for like dissemination. And I think this is an issue with even, academic knowledges, where the conversation is always a kind of, going into a local context, but then feeding it back into a kind of node, which does happen to be in the West. And I think this is also something that we at Khoj have seen shift. Well, not us, but the institution, like the kind of way in which I think in sort of the inception of Khoj also was kind of planned out as a way to have a workshop that allowed for South to South exchanges, but then also to open up networks of exchange within our more immediate, like South Asian context. But even in the 25 years Khoj has existed, like the kind of ease of doing that has shifted and changed. To think about, digital space and what it allows, but then also what you can't get out of it, because it is also a space of lack and loss and feeling, feeling like it's not enough for some kind of engagements. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess also to think about kind of the increase of surveillance on both sides of the border, how in some ways in a collaboration, the stakes are so much higher now, right? That there is so much surveillance, there is so much kind of pathologization of contact, right? That the border must separate and divide and keep apart. That any, I think, project, whether it's in the art world, the cultural world, or elsewhere, that seeks to cross over and remind us that the border is so porous, is seen with very suspect eyes by the state, right? It's endangering its project of kind of patriotism, nationality, and I think you've really seen that really increase